She was found face down in a shallow creek, her work ID still clipped to her jacket. The same jacket her mother said she wore the night she promised she'd be home before dark. For 10 years, no one knew who had done it. A promising young civil worker, gone, her body bruised, her phone missing, and her last text unread. The town moved on. People forgot. But when police reopened the case, a single fingerprint on a forgotten coffee lid exposed a truth so twisted, it shattered the illusion of who people thought they knew. Because the man responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He was the one she loved, the one who swore he'd changed, the one who helped search for her. And when they finally confronted him, what he confessed left even the investigators trembling. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit that subscribe button now and like the video. Your support helps our channel a lot. Let me know in the comments below where you are watching from. They found the thumb drive jammed behind a loose tile in Emily Hartwell's kitchen, wrapped in a page torn from an accounting ledger and a photograph of her laughing in the rain. It was the sort of discovery that didn't scream truth the moment you saw it. It whispered it, the way the smallest thing sometimes does, and then kept whispering until the whole town could no longer pretend not to hear. For 9 years, the case had been a neat little mystery that people parked to the edge of their minds like a dark curiosity. A young woman, a single wound to the back of her head, a frayed front door, a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The police file had rows of unidentified prints and no forced entry, and no clear motive stacked under a thin manila tab labeled 2010. Neighbors had argued about whether the town was safer than it felt. Her mother had carried a pocket of that cold coffee memory with her, and slept as if one day she might wake to the sound of Emily opening the front door and footsteps in the kitchen. Grief had made time soft, unreliable. Nobody had expected the past to have fingerprints. Detective Sarah Mendoza had expected nothing to be easy. She had been working cold cases in the county for 5 years when the Hartwell file came across the desk in a box of cases the chief wanted revisited with modern eyes. Sarah had a habit of staring at things too long until they gave up their secrets. She liked plain facts and stubborn timelines. She liked asking the same question until the answer changed. The Hartwell case was brittle with little that invited light. But the town had changed in 9 years. People moved in and out, records went digital, and DNA testing had become a little faster at finding truths people thought were gone. Emily Hartwell had been 28 when she died. She had the civic cadence of someone who loved order and lists. She worked in the municipal planning office handling permits and small contracts, the kind of work that made developers' lives marginally easier and citizens' lives marginally safer. She could explain a zoning code in a way that made sense and could apologize to irate contractors with the calm of someone who thought civility was armor. She had broken up with Mark Bennett 2 months before she died. Mark was a fixture, handsome in the smugly effortless way that makes people assume kindness. He coached Little League in the spring and repaired mowers for older neighbors in exchange for beer. He had a steady job with a local contractor and an older brother who had served on the city board. In a town that liked itself for its kindness and local involvement, Mark's name sounded like a promise. Anchored roots, church on Sundays, front porch curtains. Emily's friend said the breakup was messy. Mark couldn't accept the exit. They argued in restaurants, in front of baristas, on sidewalks with the soft indifference of townsfolk as witnesses. Emily's colleagues noticed he called the office a few too many times under the guise of checking in. She told a close friend she felt watched. But in a place where privacy is porous and gossip is a civic sport, the warning was not taken like an alarm. It was included in the small-town channel of complaints and then watched fade. Her death, the first investigator had concluded, had been the act of a single, terrified intruder. Invasive, quick, messy. The autopsy report said blunt force trauma to the back of the head and signs of a struggle. But the front door had been oddly unforced. A neighbor, waking to the morning light, said they had seen a man in a blue jacket walk away from the Hartwell house around 2 in the morning. The witness memory included a baseball cap, a dark truck idling on the street. The description fitted many men. The case cooled when nothing definitive tied any of those pieces together. No arrest. A mother's skull full of unanswered whys. Detective Mendoza had a list of small reasons to reopen the file. An untested smear in a domestic trash bag, a neighbor's text screenshot that had been misfiled, a donation receipt that implicated a developer who'd since been under suspicion for permit irregularities. But the turning point was the thumb drive. It was the sort of thing only grief and the stubbornness of a daughter who believed in paper found in the loose places might have produced. Emily's mother, Lydia Hartwell, had never moved out of the house. She had kept everything. When the county issued a program years later to clean and catalog abandoned property, Lydia insisted they leave the house untouched. A volunteer worker, hired to scan boxes for the cold case inventory, found a loose tile in the kitchen and a thumb drive inside a plastic bag. Lydia insisted the tile had been loose since before the funeral. She had never looked behind it. Modern forensics greeted the drive like a faucet that had been turned on. Inside were documents and photographs and a single folder labeled Notes, Do Not Open. It was the kind of label that drew the eye like a magnet. There were spreadsheets of contract numbers, images of invoices marked paid, with signatures that matched no one in the planning office, and a string of emails between Emily and an account registered in the name of an LLC that didn't appear on the public register. There were also voice notes, short, breathy recordings of Emily talking into her phone in the evening. If something happens to me, look at the files, she whispers in one. In another, she names a contractor, then coughs and laughs like she's embarrassed to be frightened. The files suggest a pattern. The planning office had issued expedited permits for a series of small construction projects on the edge of town that had, in turn, funneled money to shell companies. The developer had won multiple bids despite being years older and less experienced than competitors. The invoices bore signatures made with the same hand. Payment trails wove to the contractor Mark worked for. There was no direct evidence yet. The accounts were laundered through subcontractors and third-party vendors. But the line from Emily's attention to the paperwork, to her notes about odd approvals, to Mark's employer was a visible thread. When the evidence tech called Sarah at 4 in the morning, her voice was a dry bell. "You need to come down," he said. "We got a match on a hair, on a coffee cup. It's a long shot, but science had caught up with time. A hair found in Emily's kitchen. A single dark strand clipped in a place that suggested a scuffle. Bore mitochondrial markers that were common enough to be useless alone. But in late 2018, a man had been arrested in a different county for a string of property crimes. His DNA had been logged into a national database. One of his genetic cousins pointed toward the Bennett family. The lab found a partial profile and a residue on the coffee mug Emily had kept on the counter. A neighbor's witness statement, when re-interviewed with a fresh set of questions, remembered the truck better. It was a contractor's truck, green with a peeling logo. The truck had been photographed 5 blocks away at the time of the murder by a traffic camera. A camera that had once been overlooked because the footage had been fuzzy. The enhanced video, clearer with modern software, showed a man stepping out in a blue jacket and a baseball cap, moving with a gait Sarah had seen in other videos of Mark because he'd been the volunteer coach in youth sports recorded on the town website. Policing is equal parts patience and pressure. The new evidence was not a smoking gun. It was a constellation. Sarah needed to make it feel like a story that could not be ignored. She began pulling threads. Phone records placed Mark's phone near Emily Street that night. He had deleted his call logs. Providers preserved the metadata. A neighbor remembered a late-night argument 2 weeks before the murder. Voices raised, the kind of argument where someone says a thing they cannot unsay. When Sarah and her partner knocked at Mark's door to talk, his girlfriend, who was not his ex, answered and said he wasn't home. He was home, the phone's last ping indicated. He was not at work that night, and his employer's time books had him recorded as off. There were too many small selfies of Mark on his social account with his arm around contractors, smiling at progress, charming himself to favors. The arrest had been a small spectacle. They didn't cuff him in the driveway of his mother's house in front of church choir members. They did it at a diner on Main Street where he had been having pancakes with a friend. Sarah watched him when the officers approached. He had always been a man who expected applause. At the table he looked around as if the people were extras, and this was a scene that would reset and he would be praised for his steady presence. When the handcuffs clicked, his face shed layers like someone taking off a jacket. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer read, the script of legality wrapped around something raw. Mark answered with a long stare, and then, finally, a laugh that did not find the edges of his mouth. "You think I'm a killer?" he asked, as if the question were ridiculous and the room were an annoyance. The town watched the camera trucks file in. The news said "Arrest Shockstown" in big letters. And in small towns the quiet word "shock" folds into gossip like a knife. But the arrest itself was only the boom that announced the story. The police investigation took a long, patient breath and kept going. Mark confessed in a way that made the town's insides drop. Not a straight confession crawled from his chest like a defeated animal, but a version of the night that admitted to violence and denied premeditation. He said he had gone to Emily's house intending to talk, to plead, to convince her to give him one more chance. He said when she refused, he panicked. He denied the larger conspiracy part. He was not part of the shady contracts, he said. He only fixed things for the contractor he worked for. He cried in fits that sounded rehearsed. He kept returning to two words. It got out of hand. The interviews with his coworkers and the contractor he was employed by were a lesson in small-town denials. People lie for family, for loyalty, for fear of being dragged down by association. But documents rarely choose loyalty. They follow money. Sarah found invoices with line items that could be traced to accounts controlled by the contractor's firm. Emails showed that Emily had flagged certain permits as fast-tracked without justification. One of the contractors had complained to Mark about Emily's scrutiny. Mark had texted him, "I'll take care of it." The detective kept those texts in a folder and looked at them the way a doctor looks at a set of symptoms. Then there was the dark secret the town hadn't imagined. Emily had not only been keeping a log of the permits, she had been preparing to go public. On the thumb drive, Sarah found drafts of a letter addressed to the state attorney general. Emily had planned to hand off the documents to an investigative journalist in the nearest city. She had written the journalist a note. "They are using shell companies. Someone is getting rich. I can prove it." Her handwriting trembled in places on the page. Who had destroyed the letter? Who had decided her plan was a threat loud enough to be silenced? The evidence kept pointing to Mark as the physical instrument of the crime. But the documents suggested someone taller than his reach might have had motive to keep a quiet town quieter. The very evening the new revelations went public, the phone at the planning office rang off the hook. Citizens called to complain about nepotism in the council, about the smell of grease under City Hall. The mayor called a press conference and stayed tight-lipped, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The contractors denied wrongdoing and sent carefully worded statements about compliance and community service. Mark sat in a cell and spoke to his mother through telephone glass. She whispered that she was praying for him and for answers. It hurt Emily's mother that after 9 years, the town saw her daughter as a headline. Lydia wanted no part of the spotlight that came with the reopening of grief. She insisted, however, on coming to the arraignment. She sat in the back of the courtroom like a small, defiant figure, fingering a locket Emily had given her. When Mark entered, there was a moment that lasted too long. He looked for a split second as if he recognized the human toll of what he had done. Then he looked away. The confession did not settle everything. Prosecutors wanted stains and a chain of custody tight enough to hold in court. Forensics, bank audits, and subpoenaed emails had to be bolstered to show not just that Mark had been capable, but that his actions fit into a motive derived from a larger corruption. Emily had discovered paperwork, and those files threatened lines of revenue. The indictment read like an attempt to compress a decade of rotten dealings into a tidy legal instrument. Counts of murder, obstruction, and conspiracy. The town watched court dates like weather reports. With a dark secret, the investigation unearthed dug wider. Evidence suggested the payoff web reached into the margins of City Hall. A series of payments disguised as consulting fees traced back to a holding company owned by a man who had once been a fundraiser for the mayor. The holding company had been the invisible hand placing the developers' bids at the top of lists. There were invoices that looked like apologies from a business owner to a city official. There were gifts registered to no one. It looked like the town had been built not just on good intentions, but on an artful arithmetic of favors. People who had once thought themselves untouchable suddenly avoided eye contact at grocery stores. The volunteer coach who had shaken hands with parents at the baseball field was now on a bench in court. The man who ran the contractor's firm testified that he had no knowledge of the invoice anomalies, but his ledger told a quieter truth. A mid-level city official, the kind of person who had learned to read municipal codes and paper trails in the same breath, sat in an interview room and told investigators he had been pressured to overlook irregularities because it was better for growth. That pressure, he said, sometimes came in forms of suggestions and sometimes in checks made out to names he did not recognize. Emily had been the kind of worker who saw small inconsistencies as a pattern. She had marked up permits with red ink the way a watchmaker marks a crack gear. She had puzzled at a developer's unusual insistence on expedited timelines and the same subcontractors showing up in a neat sequence across projects. She had printed the documents and hidden them in a tile because paper is stubborn. It does not vanish like a memory. She had put the drive in a place she thought safe because she trusted the solidity of walls. She was meticulous enough to think someone could find the pattern if she tucked the pieces in a place that would outlast a hurried thief search. The town's conversations changed. There were whispers about restitution, about reputations ruined, about whether the council had known. In the coffee shops, people who had once nodded at Mark in the grocery aisle now stared to the ground. Some called him a monster. Some turned away and said his mother was a good lady who did not deserve this. People take sides to feel less uncertain in a place that preferred narrative neatness. Uncertainty was a kind of cold rain. On the day the prosecutor rested, Sarah sat on a wooden bench by the window and let sunlight warm her knees. She thought of Emily's voice notes and the way Emily had been both brave and scared. She thought of the clarity of the thumb drive and how a single object could tilt a whole town. Evidence does not always heal, but sometimes it stitches. The trial was messy in the public view. Defense lawyers painted Mark as a man who had made a terrible singular mistake, a crime of passion, unplanned and tragic. The prosecution argued it was more. The murder was an act of panic to keep a dangerous truth quiet. Emily's hidden letters were read aloud. The accountant from the planning office explained why accelerated permits were irregular. Mark's employers testified about his temperament, jealous, possessive, but not violent. And then a neighbor produced a voicemail Mark had left on his sister's phone that spoke of fixing things and keeping things quiet, recorded 3 weeks before the murder. Hearts in the courtroom contracted at the plainness of the language. Some of the town's faith in itself frayed. When the verdict finally came, the room stayed still as if everyone waited for the world to reset. Guilty on the counts that mattered, the judge said. The sentence read like a slow, flat line on which people tried to land their sorrow. Mark's face crumpled with a combination of anger and fear. Outside, a small group of protesters held pens and papers printed with Emily's face, demanding accountability for those who had profited from silence. But Sarah could not allow herself to think the case was closed. The documents hinted at deeper rot. Subpoenas had already gone out to banks. A few city council members were being looked at with more curiosity than the town had previously allowed. The contractor's firm was under federal audit. A few names in the file were redacted, but felt like the corners of a map yet to be explored. Then, in the prosecutor's office late at night, Sarah opened a small, unassuming folder marked follow-up and found two things that chilled her beyond the courtroom theatrics. A series of transfers in a shell account with wiring that looped back to a trust set up by one of the town's most respected benefactors, and a photograph, grainy and overlooked, from a community fundraiser in the summer of 2010 showing Emily standing near a table where a city official accepted what looked like an envelope. Emily's face in the photo was turned away, but her hand was on the envelope. The donor in the photo was a man with a soft voice and a tight suit who had walked the town's halls with more influence than was comfortable to count. When Sarah took that photograph to Lydia, the older woman did not cry. She sat with the image on her lap and said nothing for a long time. She wanted the town to be better, Lydia said finally. Not like this. There was, as always, the question of motive and scale. Mark had killed Emily for reasons only his mind could fully justify, whether jealousy, rage, or the conviction that silence would spare him. But the town had been living, for years, on a currency that came from corners where rules were suggestions. Emily's work had been a hazard not because she spoke to the wrong person, but because she had found a ledger that could burn those suggestions to ash. In the weeks after the conviction, Sarah found herself walking past the planning office and looking at the window where Emily used to sit. She imagined how the light had fallen across a spreadsheet in the evening, how a young woman with a sense of rightness had tried to hold a crooked place accountable. The town moved through its rituals, parades, fairs, the changing of the library's bulletin board, but also through shadow that made its people less sure of their certainties. The real shock, the one that kept the curtains of the city hall rattling at night, was not only that Mark had been arrested and convicted. It was that the line between ordinary kindness and complicity had been drawn so thin. Emily's death had been the hinge that opened a ledger. Once opened, people began to count what they had previously papered over. Donations that had looked like goodwill now had the smell of transaction. The developer's empty promises read like a ledger of favors. The cliffhanger the town could not ignore arrived in a packet marked sealed. On the day Mark was transferred to the state penitentiary. In it were 3 documents, a partial list of corporate accounts, a receipt for a series of payments to a consultant whose name was redacted, and a note from an unknown source that read in a single line, "She was getting closer." Stop digging. Who had written that note? Who had the reach to make payments vanish into the fog of shell companies? The prosecution had used the evidence to make a case against Mark. It could not yet reach for the hands that wrote checks and whispered suggestions into pliable ears. Sarah stood at the courthouse steps and watched the town from a distance where she could see both the tidy square and the older houses where more secrets might lie. She had a list of names that would be followed by subpoenas and forensic accountants and late-night phone calls. She had Emily's thumb drive, a small piece of plastic that had changed the day of a mother and made a town uneasy. She also had a file with redactions that made her think of lines drawn across maps, the sorts of lines designed to prevent outsiders from seeing a landscape's true shape. The town had a verdict and an empty place where a daughter used to be. It had a man behind bars and a ledger that wanted cleaning. The arrest had shocked it because it revealed a map of vulnerability, the places where people trusted the right people, where friendships and business interlaced until no one saw the weaving as dangerous. On the evening the trial concluded, Lydia placed Emily's photograph on her mantel, the one where Emily was laughing in the rain, and turned the frame to face away from her room. She refused to watch the town's conversations dissolve into speculation. "I want answers," she said to Sarah quietly. Her hands folded as if she were still waiting for a phone call from a daughter who had stepped out for milk. Sarah promised the thing she always promised quietly. Not closure. Closure is a parent's impossibility, but pursuit. "We'll keep going," she said, which felt like a small and inadequate sermon. The files in her desk said the same thing in a more mechanical language. Names would be subpoenaed. Accounts would be traced. The town's ledger would be pried open in ways it had not imagined. At home, Lydia slept with a voice memo of Emily tucked by her bedside. Sometimes she listened in the night, and Emily's voice sounded close and frightened and yet determined, and it felt like a conversation that had been interrupted. Once, in a whisper, Lydia played the note where Emily had said when she was talking to the journalist, "If they come for me, they'll never take the documents. I hid them." Lydia touched the locket at her throat and wondered if Emily had been brilliant or naive. The last scene the story offers is at the edge of town, where a rusted bridge crosses a shallow river. Sarah stood with the thumb drive in her palm like a small, limp thing. It had done what it could. It had made a town rethink who it was. But as she looked at the water move, she realized that some things in the town's line accounting had been set to continue whether the ledger was opened or not. The payments might stop, they might reroute, they might hide in new names. The shock of Mark's arrest had shifted the town's axis, but it had not yet purified it. There was a last unlabeled envelope in the packet from the prosecutor, with no return address and no inside note, only a single sheet of paper with a single number on it, an account number to be traced. Sarah folded it into her pocket and walked back toward the lights of Main Street, where people were already whispering and wiping the rain out of their hair. Some houses would stay the same. Some would change. The town would not be rebuilt by conviction alone. It would take names, subpoenas, courage, and time, a slow, stubborn kind of justice that makes and remakes the map. Behind Sarah, the river moved on. Ahead of her, the list of names waited. And in a small house, a mother turned off her light and kept a photograph of a daughter who had loved lists and order, and who had tried to do the correct thing in a place that had not always wanted the truth. The town had been shocked into watching. Now it had an uncomfortable choice, to keep watching or to look away. As the last line of the story is written, the evidence tech calls Sarah with a quiet voice. "We traced the number on the envelope," he says. "It goes to a trust in another state. It's connected to a name you won't like." He pauses, and there's another person in that photograph, the mayor's old advisor. He signed off on a permit 2 weeks after Emily raised the alarm. Sarah's hand tightens around the steering wheel. Rain begins in soft threads. The town behind her hums with familiarity and fear. The case that began with a single violent night in 2010 has opened into something larger. The arrest has made a wound visible, and beyond it lies an unmarked territory of accounts, signatures, and silences. She breathes and feels the cold truth settle. This is not over. It never was. And somewhere in a place where ledgers close and envelopes are passed, someone hears a town begin to count what has been paid and what has been taken. Understood. I'll continue this Kansas 2010 cold case story seamlessly for another 2,000 words. Same tone, straight narrative, slow building tension. And conclude with a devastating, emotional, shocking ending that leaves the town shaken, continuing directly from where it stopped. When the rain finally stopped that night, the town was wrapped in a kind of silence that never feels peaceful. The silence that follows the moment when people realize their story isn't over. Detective Sarah Mendoza sat in her car outside the courthouse, the paper with the traced account number glowing faintly under the dashboard light. Her phone buzzed again. It was her partner, Tyler. "You're going to want to see this," he said. "The trust account we traced is not just out of state. It's connected to a foundation, the Hartwell Education Fund." Sarah froze. "The what?" "The fund that was started after Emily's death," he said, voice dropping to a whisper. "The scholarship her mother's been giving out every year. Sarah felt her stomach sink in a way she didn't like. A deep, slow dread that made everything she thought she knew start to wobble. "That's impossible," she said, though she already knew it wasn't. That fund was set up by donations, community gifts Lydia didn't have. "Yeah," Tyler cut in. "Except one of those donations came from a holding company that matches the same LLCs Emily found in her files. The same ones that funneled money through Mark's contractor. It's all connected." For a long time, Sarah couldn't speak. The rain tapped against the glass like a metronome of unease. It was almost too cruel, too grotesque, to imagine that the same shadowy network that Emily had tried to expose had found its way into her memorial, quietly laundering guilt into generosity. The next morning, Sarah drove to Lydia Hartwell's house. The street was washed clean from the rain, but the air felt heavy. The same little blue house with the white shutters sat at the end of the block, the one that had become a landmark of tragedy for the entire county. There were always fresh flowers on the porch. Lydia opened the door before Sarah could knock. Her hair was pulled back, her face drawn but composed. "I knew you'd come," Lydia said softly. "I saw the news about the trust." Sarah stepped inside. The house smelled of coffee and cedar polish. Everything was neat, painfully neat, as if Lydia had been cleaning the same surface every day for 9 years, just to have something to do with her hands. "I need to ask you something," Sarah began. "When you started the Hartwell Fund, who helped you set it up?" Lydia didn't answer right away. Her gaze wandered toward the framed photo of Emily on the mantel. "There was a man," she said finally. "He came to me after the funeral, said he'd been a friend of Emily's, worked with her on the city projects. He said he wanted to help me do something good with her memory." "What was his name?" "Alan Rhodes," she said. "He was polite, kind. He handled the paperwork. I just signed where he told me to." Sarah's pulse ticked faster. Alan Rhodes. The name was in one of Emily's old notes. Emily had written beside it, "Consultant. Check connection to Riverscape LLC." "Lydia," Sarah said carefully, "did you ever see where the money came from? The donations?" "No," Lydia said. "I trusted him. The fund grew faster than I expected, but I thought maybe people were just being generous. Maybe they wanted to make things right." Sarah looked down at the hearted floor. There it was again, that word. The word people used to cover guilt. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said gently, "that man, Alan Rhodes, isn't who he said he was. He worked for the same developer Emily was investigating. He helped move the money through shell accounts. The same money Emily found. I think they used your fund to clean what was left of it." Lydia's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "You're saying they used my daughter's name to hide their corruption?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "For a long time. The only sound in the house was the faint hum of the refrigerator." Lydia turned toward the photo on the mantel again, her voice trembling. "She was right," she said. "They killed her because she was getting close. And now they're still here, still taking." Sarah put a hand on her shoulder. "We'll expose them," she said. "All of them." But she didn't yet know what that promise would cost. The next weeks unfolded like a slow unspooling of rot. Every thread they pulled on led to another. The Hartwell Education Fund had taken in over $500,000 in donations, money that had been gifted by at least 3 of the shell companies Emily had documented before she died. The more Sarah and Tyler dug, the clearer it became. Someone had deliberately tied Emily's name to their laundering operation, betting that no one would dare question a charity born from tragedy. Worse still, Alan Rhodes was nowhere to be found. His house was empty, his business dissolved. His last known bank withdrawal was 3 weeks earlier, cash $9,400 from a branch 2 towns over. And then one afternoon, Sarah got a call from the evidence lab. "Detective Mendoza?" "Yeah. We finished processing the envelope you turned in the one that had the account number. There were fingerprints, partial but clear enough, and they don't belong to Rhodes. Sarah leaned forward. Then who? The tech hesitated. They matched Lydia Hartwell. For a second, Sarah couldn't breathe. That can't be right. We ran it twice, the tech said quietly. Same result. Sarah hung up slowly, her mind racing. No, it had to be a mistake. Lydia had been a grieving mother, not a conspirator. She'd never even opened the envelope. She said she didn't know what it was. But fingerprints don't lie. That night, Sarah sat alone in her office with the files spread across her desk. She read Emily's old notes again. Every line of handwriting felt like a whisper from someone who had known more than anyone realized. In one of the last entries, dated a week before her death, Emily had written, "Mom said Rhodes stopped by today. Told her not to worry about the permits I've been asking about. Said it's all routine, but something's wrong. He keeps asking about the files I took home. I don't trust him, or anywhere." Sarah's eyes caught on that word, Mom. Mom said Rhodes stopped by. She went back to Lydia's earlier statement, that she'd met Rhodes only after the funeral. But Emily's note said otherwise. That was the first crack in the image Sarah had built of Lydia Hartwell, the stoic, grieving mother who had never given up hope. The second came when Sarah opened the bank records again. The Hartwell Fund had started with a $50,000 anonymous donation. But when she traced the routing path, it didn't come from a company. It came from a personal account, Lydia's own, money that, on paper, she shouldn't have had. Sarah went back to Lydia's house the next morning. She didn't bring backup. Lydia was on the porch, watering her plants. She looked up and smiled faintly. "You look tired, Detective." "I am," Sarah said. "Mind if I come in?" Inside, the house felt smaller. The air was still, heavy with something unspoken. "I need you to be honest with me," Sarah began. "Did you know Alan Rhodes before Emily died?" Lydia set down the watering can. "You already know the answer." "So you did?" Lydia nodded. "He came to our house once. Said he worked with Emily. He wanted to talk to her about the developer she'd been investigating. She was nervous, but she agreed. They talked in the kitchen. I remember because, afterward, she looked pale. She said he'd asked her to stop digging." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Did you tell the police that back then?" "No," Lydia said quietly, "because he came back the next day. Said if Emily didn't stop, bad things would happen. And when she died, he came again. Said it was an accident, that it was over. He told me he'd help me start the fund to honor her. I didn't know what else to do. I was broken." Sarah's throat felt tight. "Did he threaten you?" Lydia met her gaze, and for the first time, Sarah saw something behind the sadness, something colder. "I wasn't threatened," Lydia said softly. "I was given a choice." Sarah's chest went hollow. "What kind of choice?" "The kind where your daughter is gone, and the men who took her tell you that if you stay quiet, her death will mean something, that the money will help other girls like her, that if you say nothing, the town will think of her as a hero, not a victim." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice didn't tremble. "I wanted her remembered," Lydia said. "Not as a scandal, not as another headline." Sarah whispered, "So you helped them?" Lydia looked away. "I told myself I was helping Emily." The room was silent except for the clock ticking on the wall. Sarah took a slow breath. "Mrs. Hartwell, that envelope, the one that led me to the fund, it had your prints on it." Lydia nodded once. "I left it for you." "What?" "I found it in my mailbox a week ago," she said. "No return address, just the number. I knew what it meant. I wanted you to find the truth, even if it destroyed me, because I can't carry it anymore." Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Who sent it?" Lydia shook her head. "He did. Rhodes, or whoever's above him. It's their warning. They're cleaning up what's left." "Cleaning up?" Lydia's eyes glistened. "They're killing everyone who knows." 2 days later, the news hit like a bomb. Alan Rhodes' body was found in a motel room 3 counties away, an apparent suicide, but the details didn't match. No fingerprints on the gun. No note. The same fake name on the register that had appeared on one of the Hartwell Fund's transfers. The next morning, the Hartwell Education Fund's bank account was drained. Every dollar gone. By that afternoon, Lydia Hartwell was missing. Her car was found abandoned near the same river where Sarah had stood weeks earlier. Keys still in the ignition. Driver's door open. Inside was a note, written in Lydia's hand. Tell them Emily was right. They all knew. Don't let them bury her again. The search lasted 3 days. They dragged the river, searched the woods, knocked on every door. Nothing. No sign of Lydia Hartwell. Some said she'd walked into the water herself. Others said she'd been taken. But a week later, something arrived at the police station. An envelope addressed to Sarah. No return name. Inside was a photograph, old and grainy, taken the night before Emily's death. It showed Emily standing outside her home, and beside her in the shadows was Lydia. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned over. On the back was a single line, scrawled in black ink. The truth was never supposed to survive either of them. Months passed, but the town never felt the same again. The Hartwell Fund was dissolved, its donors questioned, its reputation shattered. The mayor resigned. The city planning office was purged and audited. Every headline felt like a funeral. Detective Sarah Mendoza was reassigned to a federal corruption task force. She told herself it was progress, that Emily's case had finally opened the wound wide enough for justice to breathe. But in quiet moments, she still heard Lydia's words. They're killing everyone who knows. And she believed it. Because on a cold morning in February, a maintenance worker found a burned-out car on the edge of a field outside town. Inside was the body of a man later identified as one of the former city council members tied to the fund, shot twice in the chest. The ignition keys were missing, just like Lydia's. Next to the body was a single unmarked USB drive. When the lab finally opened it, they found one file. It was an audio recording Emily's voice, the same breathy, fearful tone Sarah had heard before. But this one was longer. If you're hearing this, it means they found me. They told me to stop asking questions. But I can't, because what they're building isn't just houses. It's graves. They're hiding bodies in the foundations. They said it's the safest place to bury secrets. The audio cut off with a gasp and the sound of footsteps. The file was time-stamped 2 hours before Emily Hartwell was killed. When the story broke, the town convulsed. Construction sites were excavated. Under the concrete of one abandoned development, the very one Emily had been investigating. Authorities unearthed 3 skeletons, 2 male, 1 female. DNA later confirmed one of the men was Alan Rhodes. The other 2, still unidentified, and the female remains small, fragile, were a match for Lydia Hartwell. The revelation shattered every illusion the town had clung to. The woman they'd pitied, the mother they'd prayed for, had been buried in the very soil her daughter had died trying to expose. At the final press conference, Detective Sarah Mendoza stood before the cameras, eyes hollow, voice steady. Emily Hartwell uncovered a web of corruption that stretched from the city's foundations to the officials, she said. She was silenced for it. Her mother tried to protect her memory and became part of the system that killed her. In the end, both were buried by the very men they trusted. When the microphones turned off, no one clapped. The reporters didn't move. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like a wound that will never close. Outside, rain began to fall again, and somewhere beneath the foundations of that small Kansas town, the river kept running, carrying the secrets that Emily Hartwell had died to reveal. The truth had finally been unearthed, but it had taken the whole town with it. Don't forget to subscribe like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you stay updated with mystery cold cases. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from.